Welcome to this week's edition of Coach Prep. Coach Don and I are working on Zoom this week, and our topic is really kind of an interesting thing, especially for this time of year for different parts of the country. And it's the idea of our hitters versus our pitchers and ways that we can set that up and different options that we can use that allow our hitters to get more time facing live pitching, but also for our pitchers to get chances to throw pitches to hitters. They're actually trying to do something with the pitches that we throw to them. So before we get into that, though, let's talk about patreon.com/everythingfastpitch. Folks, we need more people to come on board. We want to say thank you very much to Daniel. Daniel's our newest patron. We really do appreciate him coming on board, and we really do appreciate the support that we've had from a really strong group of patrons. But the reality of the podcast world is that everything just keeps getting more expensive. And unfortunately, we've had a couple of sponsors and things like that that have fallen by the wayside. The good news is we've got that great group of patrons, so we're close, but we're still in the red every month. So if we can see a few more people come on board, we would really appreciate the help. So Don, the idea of, especially early in the season, when we haven't had a chance to play a lot of games or any games at all, is how to create an environment where our pitchers get to pitch to hitters that are actually trying to hit the ball, and our hitters to see live pitching with a pitcher who's actually trying to get outs, and how we can do that. And so there's a couple of different angles that I wanted us to talk about. And number one is the easiest one, and that's pitcher versus hitter on the field, whether it's a scrimmage situation where we've got an entire defense behind the pitcher, or maybe even just a pitcher pitching to a hitter with a catcher or a screen behind them. First off, let's start with that idea as a way to get some quality at bats for our hitters and some quality pitching time for our pitchers.
Sure, yeah, I think that this whole concept that you're talking about is really undervalued, and the time that we spend on this always seems like time that we should be doing drills, we should be doing infield work and defensive things and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, we've got to have live at bat, to create good timing, to figure out contact points, to get comfortable and get settled in. And I don't think that we create this environment enough for our players to be able to have prepared for game day like we really should. The whole hitting live thing is huge. And if we don't do this, then we shouldn't expect on those first few tournaments for our kids to be able to dig in and find a rhythm and get into that game day mode. So yeah, it's just challenging to do, and it's beneficial for the pitchers to be able to compete against the hitters, and invaluable for our hitters to get their timing too. But we might find things about our pitchers that we wouldn't otherwise have learned in terms of, being able to sequence pitches and things like that. They may have changed since last season because they're throwing harder now. A lot of different things that we can gain from taking time to do this stuff, but got to do it.
Well, the thing that I think sometimes throws people off is this idea of hitter versus pitcher doesn't necessarily have to be a full-blown scrimmage, inter-squad game kind of thing. And to the point you made about how it feels like sometimes we're taking time away from other things, there's just no nice way to say it. The actual playing a game, scrimmaging situations where we've got foul balls and pitches that don't get hit and things like that happening that don't necessarily always have action attached to them, it can feel like we're not getting enough done because the ball's not in play as much as we wish it was during our practice time. But there's ways that we can work around that and still create those at-bats for our hitters and those competitive situations for our pitchers, whether it's you have the whole defense, but every time there's a foul ball or a swing and a miss, we have a coach standing sort of close to the area around home plate, and they can hit a couple of ground balls to the infield. They can hit a couple of fly balls to the outfield. You could have two coaches, and one coach hits once around to each infielder. Another coach hits once around to each outfielder while we're waiting for that foul ball to get run down and to get reset for the next one. And so I think there's a lot of different ways that we can do it to allow both sides of the equation to get the work that they need to get. And on the field is probably the least difficult for people to wrap their heads around. But I think if you're in the part of the country where you can actually get out on the field early in the year and simulate some at-bats and get some live pitching versus live hitting stuff going on, I think that's a great thing. Now, where it gets a lot more complicated are in parts of the country where we can't get out on the field. Having spent an awful lot of time coaching in the frozen tundra of Wisconsin, we got used to doing a lot of different things that simulated live pitching or created game situations. Now, we were very lucky in the setting we had when I was coaching at Parkside is we had gym space that had floors and netting that basically almost acted like a very large batting cage. You didn't have the pitcher and the hitter in a very confined place. Now, we couldn't set up a whole team. We couldn't do all game situation stuff in a lot of settings, but we could still have a pitcher versus a hitter, and the pitcher had a little bit more of a real feel to it. She didn't feel claustrophobic being stuck in a cage. But we also did some in batting cages, which the hitters were always okay with, but a lot of the pitchers didn't like very much because they didn't like that feeling of being, so confined. The argument always was, well, if you throw it fat right down the middle on the field, it could come right back you, just like if you throw it fat right down the middle in the cage, it's going to come right back at you. But I think where the pitchers were so uncomfortable in the cages was the deflections, the balls that could hit a pipe and go in a crazy direction, the ball that hits the net above their head and drop straight down, and they can't really defend themselves because they don't have the space to react to the ball so much. So in those settings, I think finding a way to still create that competitive environment is important. And I was kind of curious what you thought about that option, because I know it's something that I think a lot of people are really struggling with trying to manage, especially this time of the year.
Yeah, Tori, no, I think that's something we just got to do. We'll get creative and, do anything that will simulate what we're going to see out on the field and just deal with it. Like you said, the ricochets and the drop balls from above on the netting, that's something that is definitely a factor, but I think that the benefit far outweighs the drawback on that.
Right.
And trying to use a pitcher's pitch count as part of our BP, I think, is important. And occasionally I feel like we don't do that because we don't want to wear our pitchers out, or we don't want for them to do too much, or, having a good plan, knowing that they're going to throw X number of innings each week in a live batting practice setting, I think might be something that we could look at as well, just so that they don't end up getting overworked and feeling like they're not able to facilitate the team need there.
One thing that I want to make sure I'm completely clear about, I'm not talking about pitchers throwing batting practice. I'm always thinking that in my entire career that we never had a pitcher throw a pitch that was anything other than trying to get a hitter out. So if we had our pitchers facing our hitters, it was competitive. Even if it was in a cage, it was still, I'm going to do everything I can to get you out, and you should do everything you can to get a hit. It was never, I'm going to throw 20 on the outside corner so you can work on hitting the outside pitch kind of thing. Because as you said, the pitchers only have so many pitches in their arm. I don't want my pitchers practicing anything other than the best pitch they can possibly throw to get somebody out. And so just to make sure we're on the same page with that, because I know people say, well, I don't want my pitchers throwing batting practice. Well, sometimes I think we say batting practice, but what we really mean is my pitcher's trying to get my hitters out, and my hitters trying to get hits against my pitchers.
I'm glad you said that, Tori, because that was the intent for sure. Is right. Anytime that hitter's hitting, I'm thinking of it as batting practice, but a competitive batting practice would be exactly what we're trying to describe for right. Sure. Pitchers are using it for their time as well, but it just seems like they only have so many each week in them. And if we're already thin on pitching, we need to make sure that we utilize all that they're capable of doing in a right. productive way. And yeah, but in a competitive setting, creating a situation for hitters to be honing their skills and for the pitchers to be doing their, working their craft. And just as you're saying and describing, on the field, if we are, in an area that we can use the fields, taking ground balls and things in between foul balls and pitches and downtime is huge. And I think that's an awesome scenario because we are getting lots of ground balls. But we can also be talking to defensive players about the idea that an outside pitch is going to be going to the opposite field. So we need to be shading or anticipating and moving in those directions. That change-ups are going to be more likely bloops for the outfielders. If the pitcher does a great job and the batter stabs at it, it's going to be a bloop over the infield. there's all kinds of things that we can play off of to make that time spent, again, occasionally we feel isn't as helpful or beneficial. We can get creative and do things that will help other aspects of the game as well. So it's just about being creative and getting after it. Yeah.
Yeah. And the only other one I wanted to throw out there, and something we've talked about in the past, is the idea of hitters standing in while pitchers are doing their pitching practice time. They're not necessarily in a situation where they're going to ever swing at a pitch, but just being in the batter's box, watching the pitch, taking an approach like I expect to swing. So while I'm watching the ball and reading it, it's like I would hit it if I could, but in this setting, I'm not allowed to swing, but I still want to see the pitches. I still want to read the spin. As you said at the very beginning, understand where that contact point needs to be, what I need to do to, to be in a strong position for the pitches that I'm seeing. Any of those options, I think, can all have certain times and places in our training. But the most important thing, and Don, you said it very, very well, that if we don't have our hitters seeing some live pitching, thinking that they're going to be ready when we start playing games is just crazy. I don't care how much coach pitch you do, how much front toss you're doing, how much old man sitting on a bucket, how much old man pretending he knows how to pitch, kinds of things you're doing. That certainly has value too, but it's nowhere near the same as seeing a real drop ball and a real rise ball and a real changeup coming from somebody who's doing something specific to try to mess you up. And so we need to make sure that we're doing that. So coaches, add that to your list of things that you need to fit into your practice. I'm not a fan of just straight scrimmaging without anything else going on, but we want to make sure that we're finding that balance between the time we need to spend on all the other stuff and helping our hitters and pitchers be ready for that in the trenches competition. So that's going to wrap up this edition of Coach Prep. Please make sure you become a patron. Go to patreon.com/everythingfastpitch. Again, thank you very much, Daniel, for being our newest patron. Please make sure you go to the fastpitchprep.com website. You can order your Square Cuts training discs there. You also have access to the YouTube channel where we have a couple of quick tutorials about the Square Cuts training discs, but also the blog posts and the drills and things like that. And again, you order those Square Cuts training discs on the fastpitchprep.com website. They're $49.95 a dozen. Let's go ahead and get those ordered up and we'll get them shipped out to you right away. And again, make sure you keep reaching out to us with Player of the Week nominations, suggestions, ideas, questions, and things you want us to talk about. Coach Don and I love having shows like we had today that were driven very, very much by feedback from listeners. We want to keep that momentum up and keep going forward with that we know for sure you're interested in. So for Coach Don McKinley and our producer, Stan Lewis, this is Coach Torrey. We'll talk to you again next week.